The psychology behind strategic abandonment has always lived in the shadows of human behavior. Even the most respected philosophers touched on it only indirectly, almost as if afraid to look at the mechanism too closely. But the pattern exists, undeniable and ancient, woven through relationships, power dynamics, and the quiet calculations that occur behind the mask of affection. What modern psychology calls intermittent reinforcement, and what philosophers from Schopenhauer to Nietzsche described as the struggle for dominance hidden under sentiment, becomes clearest in a particular behavior, the deliberate threat of leaving. In manipulation psychology, abandonment is not an accident. It is a technique, refined, sharpened, applied with timing so precise that even classical strategists like Sun Tzu would recognize its structure. The manipulator studies the emotional terrain of the partner, searching for the softest spot, the psychological bruise that never healed, the longing that has shaped their relational expectations. And when that point is found, the threat of departure becomes the perfect psychological weapon, not because it ends anything, but because it suspends everything. That suspension is where the manipulator's power fully forms. It begins with an observation phase that could easily be mistaken for affection. The manipulator listens, not the way a loving partner listens, but the way a surgeon studies where to cut. Every confession, every insecurity, every fear of being abandoned becomes mental ammunition stored for later. Freud once wrote that every human longs for a stability that reminds them of childhood safety, and that longing, when exposed, becomes a vulnerability. The manipulator does not heal that longing, does not soothe it. The manipulator memorizes it. Then, slowly, the emotional dependency is cultivated. Behavioral psychologists like B.F. Skinner showed that creatures submitted to unpredictable cycles of reward and withdrawal bond more intensely to the source of the reward than those given consistent affection. The manipulator does not need to know Skinner's experiments. Instinct is enough. They understand that consistency makes a person secure, but inconsistency makes them addicted, and addiction is where control lives. So the manipulator alternates warmth with distance, praise with silence, presence with delay, always calibrating the partner's emotional state until the slightest shift in tone becomes a source of anxiety. The partner begins to wait for text messages as if they were oxygen. They begin to study every word, every pause, every small change in expression. The manipulator knows exactly when this shift occurs. It is visible in the eyes, in the posture, in the way the partner apologizes for things that are not their fault. It is visible in the eagerness to restore harmony even when the manipulator is the one creating the disharmony. Nietzsche described this phenomenon as the will to power manifesting in the emotional realm, where one person becomes the gravitational center and the other orbits, unable to escape. Once the manipulator feels the orbit solidify, the strategic abandonment tactic begins its preparation phase. They test small distances first. A late reply here, an unexpected cold tone there, a casual mention of needing space. These are not real attempts to leave. They are pressure tests. And the partner, fearing the slightest hint of loss, responds exactly as anticipated. Increased affection, increased reassurance, increased self-doubt. The manipulator registers the reaction, adjusts the formula, and deepens the emotional dependency. At this point, modern psychology calls the partner's state pre-abandonment hypervigilance, where the nervous system becomes conditioned to anticipate loss and overcorrect to prevent it. This is where the manipulator thrives. The partner becomes so focused on preventing abandonment that they ignore the real danger, which is the manipulator's growing influence. Michel Foucault would describe this as a microphysics of power, a subtle shaping of behavior through fear rather than force. The manipulator rarely needs to raise their voice. The possibility of departure speaks louder than any argument. Then comes the pivotal moment, the heart of the tactic, the moment that determines whether the manipulator will extract maximum psychological leverage. It is the moment where the threat of leaving is introduced with precision. The manipulator waits for a moment of emotional vulnerability, after an argument or misunderstanding, something small but charged. And then, with carefully crafted detachment, they say something that resembles a resignation, a sigh of exhaustion, a suggestion that perhaps this isn't working. Or perhaps I can't keep doing this. Or the most devastating of all, maybe I should step back before we both get hurt. None of these statements are commitments. They are traps. The partner's reaction is the real objective: panic, pleading, self-blame, desperate attempts to fix what has not actually broken. In that moment, the manipulator's status shifts. They are no longer questioned, challenged, or confronted. They are elevated, feared, prioritized. The partner rewrites the narrative instantly. Perhaps they were too demanding, perhaps they misunderstood things, perhaps they should be better, softer, more careful. The manipulator watches this transformation with clinical precision. This is the psychological payoff. This is the moment of maximum gain. Philosophers like Kierkegaard describe despair as the moment when a person loses their sense of self in the attempt to preserve a relationship. Manipulators understand this intuitively. They do not aim to destroy the partner. Destruction offers no long-term benefit. They aim to dilute the partner's autonomy, to slowly erode their sense of independence until compliance replaces authenticity. Every time the partner bends to avoid abandonment, a part of their identity dissolves. The manipulator counts on this dissolution. It makes future compliance automatic. But the tactic does not end with a single threat. One threat is not enough to sustain influence. What makes the strategy powerful is its repetition with subtle variations. Each cycle increases the partner's fear and decreases their resistance. The manipulator alternates closeness and distance with the rhythm of someone tuning an instrument, slightly turning the peg, tightening the string, listening to the emotional tension rise. Clinical psychology refers to this as push-pull conditioning, one of the most addictive emotional patterns humans experience. And the partner, unaware of the pattern, confuses the emotional spikes for passion. They confuse the relief after reconciliation for love. They confuse the manipulator's return for sacrifice. Emotional chaos becomes the new normal, and the manipulator becomes the only source of relief from the chaos they themselves create. This is the paradox that makes strategic abandonment so effective. The partner clings more tightly to the person who is causing the pain, not realizing that the pain is designed, intentional, structured. What makes the strategic abandonment tactic devastating is not the threat itself, but the psychological landscape it creates. Once the partner becomes conditioned to fear the loss of the manipulator, the entire relationship shifts into a new emotional architecture, one where the partner constantly monitors their own behavior to avoid triggering another withdrawal. This self-monitoring becomes a silent prison, and the manipulator, standing outside the bars, does not need to lock the door. The partner locks it themselves. Psychologists like John Bowlby, who studied attachment theory, warned that people with anxiously attached tendencies often remain loyal to relationships where love is inconsistent, because inconsistency triggers the oldest emotional wounds. The manipulator exploits this dynamic instinctively. They identify whether the partner fears abandonment, rejection, or emotional instability, and then tailor their behavior accordingly. Someone afraid of losing a partner becomes easier to control through distance. Someone afraid of disappointing a partner becomes easier to control through criticism. Someone afraid of conflict becomes easier to control through silence. The manipulator adjusts the pressure with almost scientific precision, analyzing reactions the way a behavioral researcher observes laboratory subjects. As time passes, the partner begins to confuse anxiety with attachment. The manipulator does not need to convince them of anything. The partner convinces themselves. They tell themselves that they overreacted, that they misunderstood, that the threat of leaving was justified. They internalize the manipulator's framing of events because the fear of losing the relationship narrows their cognitive space. It is not love that binds them anymore, but anticipation of loss. And anticipation, as every major psychologist from Pavlov to modern neuroscientists like Barrage have shown, hijacks the reward system, making the person chase the relief that comes after the tension. The manipulator knows this, not intellectually perhaps, but intuitively. They sense that the partner is now operating in a state of emotional scarcity, always reaching, always seeking reassurance, always trying to prevent the next potential abandonment. In this state, the partner becomes more agreeable, more compliant, more forgiving. Their boundaries soften, their standards shift. They start interpreting emotional crumbs as evidence of devotion. The manipulator watches this shift with silent satisfaction. This is not affection, it is calibration. Nietzsche once wrote that those who fear loss offer themselves more readily to the will of others. The manipulator embodies this principle without ever needing to read it. They simply observe. Every time they pull away, the partner chases harder. Every time they offer a moment of closeness, the partner lights up with disproportionate gratitude. The imbalance grows not because the manipulator increases their power, but because the partner decreases their own. This is the brilliance of strategic abandonment. It requires little action. It thrives on the partner's own psychological patterns. In the following phase, the manipulator begins to craft a narrative where they appear burdened, misunderstood, or emotionally drained by the relationship. This is not an apology or a plea for help. It is a foundation for future control. By positioning themselves as someone who might not be able to endure this much longer, the manipulator constructs a psychological script in which the partner feels responsible for preserving the relationship. Suddenly, the emotional labor shifts completely. The partner becomes the caretaker, the fixer, the stabilizer. And once the partner steps into that role, they rarely step out. The manipulator reinforces this dynamic subtly. They sigh more often. They withdraw emotionally after minor disagreements. They mention feeling unsure or confused. They talk about needing time alone, but never clearly define what that means. Each vagueness is intentional. Clear boundaries would give the partner a sense of structure, and structure gives a sense of safety. Ambiguity keeps the partner guessing, hoping, apologizing. Ambiguity is the manipulator's silent ally. Foucault argued that the most effective forms of control are those that are invisible, normalized, and internalized. Strategic abandonment embodies this perfectly. The partner internalizes the emotional instability as part of the relationship's identity. The manipulator no longer needs to threaten to leave explicitly. The partner lives in a constant state of preventative appeasement. They avoid topics, suppress emotions, and sacrifice needs in the hope of maintaining harmony. But harmony was never the goal, compliance was. The mind, in such a state, begins to split between what it feels and what it expresses. The partner might feel neglected or confused, but they express understanding. They might feel frustrated, but they show patience. They might feel hurt, but they extend forgiveness before the manipulator even asks for it. They erase themselves quietly, gradually, piece by piece. And the manipulator, observing this erosion, becomes emboldened. Once compliance becomes predictable, influence becomes effortless. This is the point where the tactic evolves from psychological pressure into psychological governance. The manipulator begins to shape the partner's worldview, subtly guiding how they interpret events. If the partner expresses discomfort, the manipulator reframes it as overreaction. If the partner expresses confusion, the manipulator reframes it as sensitivity. If the partner expresses emotional needs, the manipulator reframes them as burdens. Language becomes a tool of distortion. Reality bends. The partner eventually begins to prioritize the manipulator's emotional stability over their own. This is one of the most devastating consequences of strategic abandonment. The partner becomes afraid not of losing the manipulator, but of triggering them. They become hyper-aware of tone, timing, and wording. They pre-edit everything they say. They apologize before there is anything to apologize for. They shrink themselves so the relationship doesn't shatter. But it is not the relationship that is fragile. It is their sense of self. Over time, the partner's emotional world becomes reorganized around the manipulator. Their highs depend on the manipulator's validation. Their lows depend on the manipulator's withdrawal. The manipulator becomes both the poison and the antidote. And the partner becomes conditioned to seek relief from the very source of distress. This is the psychological loop that Nietzsche described as the circle of dependency, where the oppressed clings to the oppressor because they believe the oppressor offers purpose. At this stage, the manipulator rarely needs to exert explicit force. The threat of abandonment has already done most of the work. Now, the partner enforces the manipulator's preferences on themselves. They self-censor, they self-blame, they self-sacrifice. The manipulator only nudges occasionally, reminding them through silence or distance or vague disappointment that stability is conditional. And because the partner never knows exactly when the next withdrawal might come, they live in a constant state of anticipatory vigilance. This psychological tension, as modern neuroscience shows, activates the survival circuits in the brain. When activated repeatedly, these circuits override logic, override boundaries, override self-preservation. The partner becomes less analytical and more reactive. They cling, they compromise, they justify. This is the moment when the manipulator achieves maximum psychological leverage. Not through cruelty in the overt sense, but through emotional economics. The partner has become attached not to the manipulator themselves, but to the cycle the manipulator created. And as long as that cycle remains intact, so does the manipulator's influence. And so, as the last thread of the strategy unravels, one truth remains suspended in the dark. Every calculated silence, every orchestrated distance, every moment of strategic absence reveals less about the victim and more about the mind that engineered it. The pattern never lies. The manipulator's greatest illusion is convincing the world that their retreat is accidental, when in reality it is a weapon sharpened over centuries of human behavior. From the cold observations of early philosophers to the clinical dissections of modern psychology, one message echoes across time. What appears as abandonment is often a blueprint, deliberately crafted to test control, pressure vulnerabilities, and measure loyalty under the weight of uncertainty. And while most people fear being left, the manipulator fears only one thing being understood. Because the moment you decode the silence, the moment you recognize that their withdrawal is not chaos but choreography, the spell fractures. The shadow behind the tactic becomes visible, and once seen, it cannot be unseen. In that instant, the power shifts, not explosively, quietly like a candle extinguishing in an empty room. The manipulator still believes you are in the dark, but you're already watching from the doorway, aware of every step they take, aware of every pause they pretend is accidental, aware of the script they thought only they could read. What remains now is the question that terrifies them the most. What happens when the person who was meant to break becomes the one who understands the entire design? What happens when the target recognizes the strategy before it unfolds? And what happens when the manipulator realizes that the fear they tried to create no longer belongs to you, but returns home to them? In the end, every tactic built on illusion eventually collapses under the weight of awareness. Every strategic absence becomes a mirror they cannot escape, and every attempt to pull away for power becomes a reminder of how fragile that power truly is. The darkness that once hid their intentions now exposes them, and the silence they weaponized becomes the echo of their own unraveling. And as the final frame fades to black, remember, knowledge is the one thing they cannot abandon, the one thing they cannot silence, the one thing they cannot threaten to take away. Because once you understand the blueprint, the game ends and the darkness loses its architect. Fade out.